She walked onto the training yard in worn-out boots and instantly became the joke of the camp. They laughed when food splattered across her jacket, cheered when she stumbled in the mud, and were certain Maya Johnson was nothing but dead weight. But they were wrong. When her torn shirt revealed the tattoo on her back, silence swallowed the laughter. And that was only the beginning. The morning sun poured down on the training yard, turning the cracked pavement into a shimmering stage where egos strutted and laughter cut sharper than any blade. Recruits moved in clusters, adjusting uniforms that still looked too stiff, too clean, as if they belonged to actors rehearsing war rather than men and women preparing to uphold the law. And then she walked in, Maya Johnson, her backpack hanging from one stubborn strap, boots scuffed raw, jacket faded until it was neither green nor gray, but some tired color in between. She didn't look like the others, and that was enough. A boyish voice rang out, brash and eager to be noticed. "Hey, check it out. Did somebody lose their cleaning lady?" The yard erupted with laughter. Even those who didn't find it funny smirked nervously, afraid to be the odd one out. Maya stepped slow just for a second, then steadied. She didn't flinch, didn't frown. Her eyes, dark and unreadable, stayed fixed on the line of recruits ahead. She kept walking. But ignoring cruelty has never been a shield. It only draws more fire. A tall recruit with a perfect haircut and teeth that gleamed like polished brass elbowed his friend and raised his voice so the instructors could almost hear. Maybe she took a wrong turn from the soup kitchen. Somebody point her toward the shelter. More laughter. A few clapped their hands as though the yard had turned into a comedy stage. Maya adjusted the strap on her pack and moved past them, her pace unhurried. She didn't say a word. That silence stung them more than any comeback could have. Kyle, the loudest of the bunch, leaned forward, blocking her path with the swagger of a man who'd never been told no. "What's in the bag, Grandma? Lunch for the rest of us, or just your knitting needles?" Maya's eyes met his for the first time. They weren't angry eyes. They weren't pleading either. They were calm, still as a winter lake. And in that stillness, Kyle found nothing to bounce his cruelty off of, nothing to spark the laughter he craved. It rattled him, though he'd never admit it. "Move," she said simply. Her voice was low, flat, without decoration. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't even a command. It was a statement of fact. Kyle snorted and stepped aside, making a show of bowing like she was royalty. His buddies howled again, pleased with their ringmaster. Maya walked through them, head level, boots striking the ground in steady rhythm. Each step was a quiet defiance, but no one in that yard knew how to read it. To them, she was just the joke of the morning, the story they'd retell at dinner, the clip they'd share if anyone had thought to film it. Near the edge of the yard, one pair of eyes didn't join the laughter. Miguel, a recruit with shoulders too thin for his uniform and a memory full of slurs he'd learned to swallow, watched her carefully. He saw the way she held her pack close, not like it was heavy, but like it carried something worth protecting. He noticed the steadiness of her breath, the way her eyes swept the ground and the fences beyond, as though mapping the space instead of enduring it. Something about her didn't match the story being told. But Miguel kept that thought to himself. Across the yard, the instructors barked orders. Names were called, lines formed, and the rhythm of discipline began to stamp out the morning chaos. Still, the laughter lingered in the air, a bitter perfume that clung to Maya as she moved into formation. Her jacket was too thin for the chill, her boots too worn for the long hours ahead, and her presence too quiet for a place built on shouting and posturing. Someone muttered behind her, just loud enough to sting. "Dead weight." Another chuckled. "Quota filler." Maya didn't turn. She adjusted her stance, squared her shoulders, and faced forward. The line shuffled around her, already calculating who would fail, who would rise, and who would be easy to crush along the way. To them, she was easy prey. To Maya, it was just another morning. She'd endured worse in places no one here could imagine. The whistle blew, and the yard jolted to life. Feet pounded, arms swung, shouts cut through the air. Recruits strained for attention, desperate to prove themselves faster, stronger, louder. Maya ran with them, not pushing ahead, not lagging behind, just steady. Her boots slapped the pavement, her breath even, her eyes fixed on the line ahead. But no matter how steady she moved, the laughter clung. It followed her like a shadow. By the time the whistle shrieked again and the recruits slowed, sweat darkening their shirts, Maya's silence had already written her role in their story. She wasn't one of them. She was the outsider, the odd note in their chorus of ambition. And in a place where weakness was mocked before it was mended, she had been cast as the morning's entertainment. When the yard emptied, leaving only scuff marks and echoes behind, Maya lingered for a moment, standing alone in the fading noise. Her pack slipped slightly, and she pulled the strap tighter, adjusting with the practiced hands of someone who had been carrying burdens far longer than these recruits had been alive. She looked once at the spot where they'd laughed the loudest, then turned away without expression. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was the beginning of something none of them could yet understand. The mess hall always smelled like bleach and overcooked beans, a place where voices bounced off the steel ceiling, and every recruit tried to be louder than the next. Long rows of tables stretched like a cafeteria from some forgotten high school. Only here, the competition wasn't about popularity. It was about dominance. By the second week, the hierarchy was already taking shape. The loud ones sat together, the strong ones bragged about their times on the obstacle course, and those who didn't fit the mold sat alone. Maya Johnson was the only one who seemed perfectly comfortable at the far end of the room, with no one beside her. She carried her tray with the same steady rhythm as she carried her pack, eyes lowered, shoulders square, as though she'd mapped every step before she took it. Kyle spotted her first, because of course he did. He thrived on attention the way other people needed oxygen. A smirk stretched across his face as he cut in line and strutted toward her table, tray in hand, his friends trailing close behind. The room was loud, but the second he pulled up a chair at Maya's lonely corner, the noise shifted. Heads turned. Conversations dipped. It was instinctual, the scent of trouble in the air. "Well, look at this," Kyle said, his voice pitched high enough to carry across half the hall. "Didn't realize the shelter had a branch office here. You waiting on your free meal, Grandma?" His buddies laughed, too quickly, too eagerly, like they didn't want to miss their cue. Maya lifted her fork, scooped up a bite of mashed potatoes, and placed it in her mouth. She chewed slowly, calmly, as if he weren't even there. The steadiness of it, the refusal to rise to the bait, made Kyle's smirk twitch. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, bringing his face too close to hers. "You know, this isn't exactly a soup kitchen. We're real recruits here. Maybe you're just lost. You lost, sweetheart?" Maya set down her fork with careful precision, wiped her mouth with the corner of her napkin, and looked him dead in the eye. "I'm eating," she said. The simplicity of it, the refusal to play the game, made his friends howl. But behind the laughter there was a flicker of unease, as though they knew her silence had more weight than their words. Kyle's jaw flexed, his grin widening, but there was something desperate in it now. He reached across the table and flicked his tray with a sharp snap of his fingers. The edge of his plate lifted just enough to send gravy and potatoes splattering across Maya's faded jacket. The mess hall erupted in laughter. Phones came out, screens glowing as the humiliation was recorded, eager for another clip to share in the dorms. Someone shouted, "Smile for the camera!" and the crowd roared again. It was cruel, thoughtless, the way only young people can be when they believe themselves untouchable. Maya's hands moved slowly, methodically, as if she had all the time in the world. She picked up a napkin, dabbed at the stain, and continued eating. Bite, chew, swallow. The routine of survival. She didn't look at Kyle, didn't glance at the phones pointed in her direction, didn't give them a single crack to wedge their cruelty into. Her composure was so complete, it made the laughter falter, the edge of it turning brittle. Miguel sat 2 tables away, watching carefully. He didn't laugh, didn't record, didn't cheer. He saw the way her fingers held the fork, steady, trained, not a tremor in sight. He saw the way her breathing never hitched, not even when the food splattered across her chest. And he wondered again who this woman really was. "Come on," Kyle barked, louder now, sensing he was losing the crowd. "You gonna take that? You think sitting there all quiet makes you special? Makes you better than us?" His voice cracked on the last word, and for a heartbeat, the laughter thinned into silence. Maya swallowed another bite, set her fork down neatly on the tray, and turned her head just enough to meet his stare. Her eyes were calm, flat, bottomless. "You're in my light," she said quietly. The words were nothing, ordinary, but the way she said them, the stillness in her voice, the certainty in her gaze, sent a ripple across the room. It wasn't a threat, but it wasn't submission either. It was something else entirely, something that made Kyle lean back just a fraction before forcing himself forward again. "She's crazy," one of his friends muttered, and the laughter bubbled back, covering the unease like a blanket. Kyle stood, tray clattering as he shoved away from the table. "Enjoy your potatoes, Grandma," he sneered. "You're the punchline now." As he walked off, the phones lowered, the crowd shifting back to their own conversations. But the echo of what had just happened lingered. Some recruits smirked, replaying the moment in their heads, eager to share the video later. Others frowned, unsettled by her refusal to break, her refusal to play the role they'd written for her. Maya finished her meal, wiped her tray clean, and stood. The stain on her jacket was dark, spreading across the fabric, but she wore it like it didn't matter. She carried her tray to the return line, her steps steady, eyes forward. Behind her, whispers followed. She didn't even flinch. Creepy. What's wrong with her? Miguel stayed silent. He watched her walk out of the mess hall with the same deliberate calm she carried everywhere, and something in his chest tightened. He remembered the first time someone had dumped food on him back in high school, the way he'd shouted and cursed, the way it had only made the bullies laugh harder. He remembered the sting of humiliation, the taste of rage in his mouth. Maya had none of that on her face. She had something else, something he couldn't name. When the doors closed behind her, the room felt louder, more chaotic, like her silence had been holding something back, and now it had been released. Kyle strutted to his usual table, laughing too hard, retelling the scene as though he'd won a great victory. His friends echoed him, slapping each other's shoulders, feeding off the performance. But under the surface, an unease lingered. The clip would circulate, the jokes would spread, but the image that would haunt them wasn't the stain on her jacket. It was the way she looked at him, calm and unbroken, as if she were the one in control all along. Later, in the quiet of her dorm room, Maya hung her jacket over the back of a chair and sat on the narrow bed. The faint hum of laughter from the mess hall still carried through the walls, but she closed her eyes and breathed slowly, evenly, until it faded into the background. She touched the damp spot on her sleeve where the gravy had soaked in, then let her hand drop away. It didn't matter. She'd been through worse. Much worse. The world thought silence was weakness, but silence, properly held, could be sharper than a blade. And though none of them knew it yet, Maya Johnson was a woman who had learned long ago how to let people laugh, until the moment came when laughter would turn to fear. Miguel woke before dawn, long before the bugle cut through the chill air, because the dorms never truly slept. The rustle of sheets, the coughs, the shuffling of boots on concrete floors, he had learned to live with all of it. That morning, though, something pulled him from his bed and made him sit on the edge with his elbows on his knees, staring into the dark. It was the image of Maya in the mess hall, gravy staining her jacket, sitting calm while the room roared. He'd replayed it so many times his stomach felt raw. He had seen silence before, the broken kind, the kind born of defeat. This had been different. She hadn't shrunk into herself or hidden. She had simply gone on, as though their cruelty were no more than rain against a window. When the lights flickered on and the day began, Miguel moved with the others, but his eyes kept finding her. She was there in formation, the same faded jacket zipped high, boots scuffed at the toes, standing straight without fidgeting. The sergeant barked orders, the line shuffled, and still she seemed anchored, as if nothing could push her off her mark. The morning run cut across the training field, dust rising in clouds under pounding feet. Recruits jostled for position, shouting to each other, turning it into a race that was never meant to be a race. Miguel kept his pace even, watching. Maya ran in the middle of the pack, not fighting to be first, not lagging behind. Her strides were steady, her breath measured. At one point her shoelace came undone. He expected her to stumble, maybe curse, but she slowed just enough to kneel, retied the frayed lace with quick, practiced fingers, and slipped back into stride without missing a beat. The whole movement took seconds. It was so smooth that if you blinked you'd miss it. Clumsy old bat, someone muttered as they passed her, but Miguel had seen something else. Those weren't the fumbling fingers of someone unused to labor. That was precision. His cousin had served overseas, and Miguel remembered watching him clean his rifle on leave. Same economy of movement, same efficiency, nothing wasted. Later, during strength training, the instructors rolled out sandbags for the recruits to carry across the yard. Each one weighed close to 50 pounds. Some recruits staggered, backs bent, arms straining. When it was Maya's turn, she bent, lifted, and hoisted it over her shoulder in one clean motion. She didn't groan, didn't wince. She walked the required distance, set it down, and stood waiting for the next instruction. Kyle, who had been watching from the sidelines, laughed loud enough for everyone to hear. "Guess they make lighter bags for charity cases." His friends snickered, but Miguel saw the way the instructor's eyes flicked from Maya to the sandbag and back, something unreadable in his expression. In the afternoon came the wall climb. Recruits sprinted, leapt, and clawed their way up the tall wooden barrier. Most had to try twice, 3 times, before hauling themselves over. Maya reached the wall, placed her palms flat, and vaulted up with a smoothness that startled even Miguel. She didn't make it look easy exactly, but she made it look inevitable, like gravity had less hold on her than the rest of them. When she landed on the other side, Kyle jeered again, but it sounded thinner now, like his voice couldn't quite find its footing. By the time the day's drills ended, Miguel's suspicions had hardened into something heavier. He sat at his bunk that evening, turning his boots in his hands, thinking about the patterns. Most people wore their exhaustion like a badge, groaning, bragging about how they'd pushed through. Maya never bragged, never groaned. She just kept moving, quiet and controlled, as if she were working from a script the rest of them hadn't been given. He found her later, sitting on the edge of the field as the sun bled into the horizon, lacing and relacing her boots. She didn't notice him at first, or maybe she did and just didn't care. He hesitated, then sat a few feet away. "You always tie them the same way," he said. His voice came out softer than he meant. She glanced at him, expression unrateable. "It works." "Yeah, but it's fast, like you've done it 1,000,000 times." Maya looked back at the horizon, the last light slipping behind the trees. "Maybe I have." He wanted to ask more, to press, but the tone in her voice stopped him. Not cold, not unfriendly, just final. Like a door that could open if you had the right key, but he didn't. Not yet. From the dorm windows behind them, laughter carried again. Kyle's voice, Madison's shrill giggle, the chorus of those who'd found amusement in another's humiliation. Miguel felt heat rise in his chest, the same heat he'd known back home, fists clenched in playground fights he'd never won. He wanted to march inside, to slam a fist into Kyle's grin. But what good would that do? He'd be the one punished. And Maya would probably keep sitting there, calm as ever. "You don't care what they say?" he asked quietly. Her hands stilled on the laces. For the first time, he thought he saw something flicker in her face, something almost weary. Then it was gone. "Words don't break skin," she said. Miguel looked down at his own hands, scarred from stupid fights and harder jobs, and wondered if that was true. The whistle blew, calling them back inside. Maya rose, brushed dirt from her pants, and walked past him without waiting. Miguel stayed a moment longer, staring at the ground where she'd sat. He knew one thing with certainty. Whatever she carried inside, it wasn't weakness. And one day soon, the rest of them would see it too. When he finally returned to the dorms, Kyle was reenacting the mess hall scene for a fresh crowd, making his gestures bigger, his voice louder, his story more twisted with every retelling. The others laughed, though some glanced away when Miguel walked past. He ignored them, stretched out on his bunk, and closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids he saw Maya again, tying her boots with those quick, deliberate fingers. He didn't know what she was hiding, but he knew one thing for sure. Nobody who moved like that was ordinary, and no amount of laughter would change it. The range smelled of oil and gunpowder long before the first round was fired. Rows of recruits shuffled into position, some flexing their hands nervously, some cracking jokes too loud, masking the edge in their voices. Targets loomed at the far end, paper silhouettes pinned against the berm, waiting to be punched full of holes. The instructors walked the line like wardens, their boots heavy, eyes sharp, daring anyone to show weakness. Guns lay on the tables, cold metal catching the pale morning light. Miguel slid into place, checking the rifle he'd been issued. He wiped his palms on his pants, breathing through the tension. 2 tables down, Kyle was already putting on a show, spinning his weapon with false confidence, grinning at anyone who would look. "Watch and learn," he told the group around him. "Daddy taught me to shoot before I could ride a bike." His friends laughed on cue, but even they gripped their rifles like they knew this was no joke. Maya walked in at the end of the line, jacket zipped, boots laced tight, the same unhurried stride she carried everywhere. She took her place without a word, hands steady as she checked her weapon. No chatter, no show, just quiet preparation. The sergeant barked the order, and the first round began. Madison stepped up, blonde ponytail pulled too tight, jaw clenched with the strain of concentration. Her shot scattered wide, the target barely nicked. She cursed under her breath, lowered her weapon, and stalked off as whispers trailed behind her. Kyle went next, throwing himself into position like an athlete. He fired too fast, teeth bared in a grin after each shot, as if willing the paperman down by charm alone. 4 landed in the chest, 1 clean miss. "Not bad," he crowed, raising his eyebrows at his buddies. They clapped him on the back, relief flooding their laughter. Then came Maya's turn. She stepped forward with no announcement, no build-up. The weapon rested against her shoulder like it belonged there. She didn't fiddle with the scope, didn't take long to breathe or stretch or mutter a prayer. She simply lifted the rifle, inhaled, and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked, echoing across the range. A hole appeared dead center on the target's chest. Another breath, another shot. Again, perfect center. The sound of her firing rhythm was steady, mechanical, each round following the next like notes in a song already written. 5 shots, 5 bullseyes. The line fell quiet. Even the instructors hesitated, blinking at the target downrange. No hesitation, no wasted motion, no nerves, just precision so exact it seemed impossible. One of the recruits let out a low whistle before catching himself. Madison muttered something under her breath, but her face was pale, her lips pressed tight. Kyle laughed, but it rang false. "Lucky streak," he said, too loudly. "Even a blind squirrel gets a nut." Maya lowered her weapon, cleared it with practiced ease, and stepped back from the table. Her face gave nothing away. She didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't even look at the stunned faces around her. She returned to her place in line, folding her hands behind her back, waiting as if nothing unusual had happened. Miguel couldn't look away. He'd been searching for proof that she wasn't ordinary, and now he had it. But instead of satisfying his curiosity, it only deepened it. Those shots hadn't been luck. He knew enough about rifles to see it, the control in her breathing, the way her body barely moved with the recoil, the speed of her reset. That wasn't training you picked up in a few weeks at an academy. That was years, maybe decades, of discipline burned into muscle memory. The sergeant cleared his throat, his voice harsher than before, as though covering something. "Next group," he barked, forcing the moment back into routine. The recruits shuffled, but their eyes kept darting toward Maya, their expressions caught between suspicion and unease. As the afternoon wore on, the whispers began. At first they were scattered, muttered under breaths. "How'd she do that?" "No way that was chance." "You see her hands? Didn't even shake." By dinner, the whispers grew teeth. Some claimed she was former military, washed out and clawing her way back. Others said she must have cheated somehow, rigged her weapon. The more outlandish the story, the quicker it spread. It was easier to believe a lie than to face the possibility that the quiet woman they mocked might be something more. Kyle stoked the fire, retelling the scene with embellishments. "Scope was off, I swear," he said, slapping his knee. "That piece is junk. She must have messed with it, set it up before we got there." His friends nodded, eager to keep the balance of the world intact, where Kyle was the golden boy and Maya was the punchline. But Miguel kept his thoughts to himself. He lay on his bunk that night, staring at the ceiling, hearing the gunfire echo in his head. Each shot replayed perfectly, as steady in memory as it had been in reality. He had the strange sense that Maya hadn't just been hitting targets. She had been revealing something, piece by piece, though none of them were ready to see it yet. And when he closed his eyes, he remembered the way the range had gone silent, the air pulled tight around them like a held breath. It wasn't just her aim that unsettled them. It was the certainty, the unshakable sense that Maya Johnson was no beginner, no charity case, no misfit to be laughed at. She was something else entirely. They didn't know it yet, but the first crack had appeared in the story they'd written for her. And cracks have a way of spreading until the whole structure collapses in silence. The dorms quieted slower than they should have that night. Showers hissed down the hall. Voices rose and fell. Bursts of laughter carried like echoes through thin walls. Maya sat on her bunk, back against the cinder block, the single bulb above her bed casting a tired yellow circle over the room. Her jacket hung on the chair, still damp at the cuffs from the cleaning rag she'd used on the stains, and her boots rested neatly side by side beneath her. She opened her backpack and pulled out a worn leather wallet, the edges frayed, the stitching coming loose at the corners. From it she drew a photograph, folded and unfolded so many times the creases had begun to split. The picture showed her younger, maybe 10 years back, hair shorter, smile half-formed, standing beside a man in a uniform. His face was blurred, not by time but by intention, as though whoever had printed it had wanted him hidden. His hand rested on her shoulder, firm, protective. On his exposed arm was an emblem inked into his skin, dark lines twisting into a shape that looked both proud and dangerous. Maya ran her finger along the outline, tracing the symbol she knew by heart, her expression unreadable. For a moment her lips parted, as if she might speak to the man in the picture, but she only breathed out and pressed the photo against her chest. The door creaked, and she quickly slipped the photo back into the wallet, snapping it shut. Sarah, one of the quieter recruits, stepped inside. She wasn't part of Kyle's circle, though she often sat close enough to laugh along. Tonight her face was pale, her arms wrapped around a towel. She froze when she saw Maya sitting there, the wallet still in her hands. For a second, neither moved. Sarah looked away first, muttering, "Didn't mean to interrupt." Maya didn't answer, just tucked the wallet into the bottom of her pack and folded her hands on her knees. Sarah lingered by her bunk, pretending to adjust the blanket, eyes flicking once more toward Maya. "That a family photo?" she asked lightly, her voice a notch too high. Maya's gaze lifted to meet hers. The silence stretched, heavy enough to make Sarah shift from foot to foot. "Something like that?" Maya said finally, her tone flat, not an invitation. Sarah nodded quickly and busied herself with her sheets, though her hands fumbled with the corners. She didn't press further, but the image of Maya with that hidden photograph was burned into her mind. Later, when the lights were cut and the room fell into darkness, Sarah lay awake listening to the soft rhythm of breathing all around her. She couldn't stop replaying what she had seen, the way Maya's expression had softened, the way she'd guarded that picture as if it contained something sacred. Sarah had mocked her before, laughed when others did, but now a splinter of doubt lodged under her skin. There was more to the woman than the ragged boots and worn jacket, something deep and private, something that didn't belong to the story the rest of the recruits had written for her. Maya, for her part, lay staring at the ceiling, the image of the man's blurred face etched against her closed eyes. Memories stirred that she'd long since learned to push away, the weight of his hand on her shoulder, the sharpness in his voice when he drilled her, the moments of quiet in between when his eyes carried pride he never spoke aloud. Those years were locked away, but tonight, with the laughter of her peers still ringing faintly in the halls, the lock felt fragile. She turned on her side, pressing her face into the pillow, willing herself to sleep. Tomorrow would bring more tests, more jeers, more chances for them to strip her down with words and pranks, but none of them knew about the photo. None of them knew what that mark meant, the one carved into memory and skin. She had no intention of telling them. Let them think what they wanted. The truth was hers to keep, and keeping it was survival. Across the room, Sarah opened her eyes in the dark, listening for any sound from Maya's bunk. There was nothing but steady breathing. Still, she whispered under her breath, too quiet for anyone to hear, "Who are you really?" Maya didn't stir. She wouldn't have answered, even if she had. The obstacle course stretched like a gauntlet across the training field. Mud pits steaming in the morning cold, walls slick from last night's rain, ropes swaying in the breeze like taunts waiting to trip someone up. The recruits lined up with jittery energy, some slapping each other's backs, others muttering prayers, all of them hungry for points that might earn them favor with the instructors. The whistle blew, sharp and merciless, and bodies surged forward in a storm of shouting and grunts. Maya moved at her usual pace, steady, controlled, not rushing to be first, not dragging behind. Her eyes scanned the course ahead as if she had already memorized the angles of every wall, every trench. She vaulted the first barrier with quiet efficiency, rolled through the mud without hesitation, and came up coated but unshaken. Around her, recruits stumbled, cursed, and scrambled, but she kept moving as though the chaos were happening in another world. Kyle watched her from behind, jaw tight, irritation simmering. Every time she stayed calm, it dug under his skin. She was supposed to break, supposed to flail and stumble so he could laugh and lead the jeers. Instead, her composure mocked him in silence. As they neared the rope climb, he made his move. A quick shove, small enough to look accidental, sent her off balance. Maya hit the mud hard, knees sinking, palms smearing against the wet ground. The recruits behind them howled with laughter, voices carrying over the din. "Nice dive, Grandma," someone shouted. The team groaned as the stopwatch ticked on. Points lost, penalties racked. Nobody cared that it was Kyle's elbow that had caught her mid-step. They only saw Maya sprawled in the mud, dragging the team down again. "Get up," an instructor barked. She did. Without a word, she planted her boots in the muck, pushed herself upright, and kept going. Mud streaked her face, soaked her clothes, clung to her every step, but her jaw stayed tight and her eyes forward. She reached the rope, wiped her hands once on her thighs, and climbed. Her body moved like it remembered every knot, every pull, muscles working in rhythm until she swung over the top and dropped down the other side. The recruits who had laughed fell quiet for a moment, unsettled by the way she turned humiliation into motion, as if their cruelty had only been fuel. But the damage was done. When the course ended, the scoreboard reflected the penalty. Their squad lost valuable points, and the recruits turned their frustration on her. In the yard, still panting and streaked with mud, Kyle crossed his arms and smirked. "Thanks for the drag, Johnson. Guess charity cases don't come with balance training." Others muttered in agreement, shooting her looks filled with blame. The sting wasn't just in their words, but in the way they pulled away from her, the isolation becoming complete. She had become the scapegoat, the reason they weren't climbing the ranks as fast as they wanted. Miguel stepped forward, voice low but firm. "It wasn't her fault. I saw what happened." Kyle's head snapped toward him. "What'd you see? Her tripping over her own boots? Don't waste your breath defending her, man. She's dead weight." Miguel's fists clenched, but Maya's voice cut through before he could answer. "Leave it." It wasn't loud, but it carried. Miguel looked at her, mud dripping from her chin, eyes steady as stone. She didn't need his defense. Or maybe she wouldn't allow it. Either way, she turned and walked toward the lockers, her boots squelching with every step. The crowd parted just enough to let her through, mutters chasing her like gnats. Inside the locker room, the air was thick with sweat and disinfectant. Maya peeled off her soaked jacket, wrung out her shirt, and rinsed her hands under the tap. Mud swirled down the drain, but the sting of their voices clung harder than the dirt. She caught her reflection in the cracked mirror, hair plastered to her forehead, bruise blooming on her shoulder where Kyle's elbow had struck. She pressed her palm against it, closed her eyes, and breathed. One slow inhale, one slow exhale, steadying herself against the weight of being everyone's target. Outside, the laughter had already resumed. The recruits retold the moment of her fall like a story at a bar, each embellishing the details, each one louder than the last. They didn't see her precision in the climb, didn't note the way she had recovered faster than most of them ever could. They only saw the stumble, the penalty, the points lost. It was easier that way, easier to believe she was weak. Miguel lingered at the edge of the group, silent, his eyes on the mud still drying on the course. He knew what he'd seen. That shove hadn't been clumsy. It had been deliberate, calculated. And Maya had taken the fall without a word, carried the blame without defense. He wondered what kind of person endures like that, what kind of history teaches someone to swallow humiliation and turn it into silence. As the sun sank lower and the yard emptied, Maya walked alone back to the dorms, her boots leaving heavy prints across the gravel. She didn't look back at the course, didn't look at the recruits still buzzing with laughter. Her focus was forward, always forward, as if the only way through the storm was straight into it. And though the day had ended with another scar on her back, another story added to the pile, she knew something the rest of them didn't. Humiliation, carried long enough, had a way of hardening into resolve, and resolve, when tested, could break even the loudest voices into silence. The sun was brutal that afternoon, beating down on the cracked dirt track until the heat shimmered in waves. The recruits lined up for the endurance run, each of them already drenched in sweat from the morning drills. The air smelled of dust and exhaustion, and the sergeant's voice cut through it all like a whip. 10 miles. No excuses, no stragglers. Move. The whistle blew and the formation surged forward, boots pounding in rhythm. Maya kept her pace even, the same calm rhythm that had carried her through every drill so far. She didn't rush to be first. She didn't lag behind. Her eyes stayed fixed on the track ahead, her breathing measured. Around her, recruits shouted, cursed, encouraged one another, trying to make the distance seem shorter by drowning it in noise. She remained silent. By the second mile, the heat began to gnaw at everyone. Shirts clung to skin, breaths came ragged. Madison drifted close to Maya, her blonde ponytail whipping like a flag, her face twisted with annoyance. She'd been muttering since the run began, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Pick it up, charity case. You're dragging us down." When Maya didn't respond, Madison's mutters sharpened. She drifted closer, elbow brushing against Maya's arm, and at the 4th mile she made her move. A small stone, sharp-edged and cruel, had been tucked into her palm. As they rounded the curve, Madison bent low, pretending to stumble, and shoved it into Maya's boot with a flick of her wrist. It took only a second, but it was enough. Maya's stride faltered as the rock dug into the tender flesh beneath her toes. Pain shot up her leg with every step, but she didn't stop. She adjusted her pace, gritting her teeth, keeping her face unreadable. Madison smirked and surged ahead, her complaints turning to laughter as she joined the others. By the 6th mile, blood had begun to seep into Maya's sock. Every footfall felt like fire, the stone grinding deeper, skin tearing with each impact. Sweat poured down her temples, stinging her eyes, but her breathing stayed steady. She could hear the recruits behind her laughing, whispering, "Look at her limp. Won't last another mile." She ignored them. Miguel noticed. He always noticed. From a few steps back, he saw the way she shifted her weight, the slight hitch in her stride. He caught a glimpse of red darkening the side of her boot. His chest tightened with anger, but he held his tongue. The sergeant wouldn't care. The others would laugh harder. Only Maya seemed unconcerned, as if the wound were nothing more than weather she had to endure. By the 8th mile, the pain had spread into her calf, her thigh, radiating through her entire leg. Each step was a battle between will and body, but she refused to slow. The sergeant's voice barked from the sidelines, calling out times, threatening penalties for anyone who fell out of formation. Maya pressed on, jaw clenched, eyes locked ahead. At the 9th mile, Madison fell back into stride beside her, pretending to huff with exhaustion. She glanced down at Maya's limp and smirked. "Told dead weight, can't even keep up." Her voice dripped with cruelty, but for the first time Maya looked at her. Just a glance, brief but cutting. Madison flinched before quickly masking it with another laugh. When the formation crossed the finish line, the recruits collapsed in the dust, some sprawling on their backs, others bending double with hands on knees. Maya kept moving, her limp more pronounced now, but she didn't stop until the sergeant barked for her. "Johnson, 5 extra laps. You broke formation." His voice carried no sympathy, only judgment. Groans rose from the group, frustration boiling over. Kyle sneered, wiping sweat from his brow. "Thanks for that, Johnson. Real team player." The stone was still in her boot. The blood was still seeping. She said nothing. She turned, dropped back onto the track, and began running again. 1 lap. 2. By the 3rd, her face was pale, her breaths ragged, sweat and blood mixed, staining her sock. The recruits watched, some smirking, others shaking their heads. Madison tossed an empty water bottle at her feet as she passed. "Hydrate with air," she said, laughing at her own joke. Maya didn't stop. She crushed the bottle beneath her heel and kept running. Each lap was slower, each step heavier, but she finished all 5 without a word. When she finally staggered to the line, she bent double, hands on her knees, gulping air. The sergeant gave a curt nod and dismissed the group. As the recruits shuffled toward the barracks, Miguel lingered, watching Maya limp toward the lockers. He wanted to say something, to offer help, but the look on her face kept him still. It wasn't pride exactly. It was something harder, something untouchable. She had bled in front of them all, and still she had not broken. Later, in the dim light of the locker room, Maya unlaced her boot with slow, careful fingers. The sock peeled away, soaked with blood, skin raw and torn. She winced once, quietly, then cleaned the wound with water from the tap. Her hands were steady even as her foot trembled. She wrapped it with a strip of cloth torn from her undershirt, pulled the boot back on, and tied the laces tight. Outside, laughter still echoed across the yard, but it sounded thinner now, forced. The image of her limping, bleeding, yet refusing to quit had carved itself into their minds. They would tell the story differently, mocking her stubbornness, blaming her for lost points. But deep down, some of them felt something else, unease. Miguel lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of the dorm. He couldn't shake the picture of her foot, the blood soaking through, the way she had run those laps without a sound. It wasn't normal. It wasn't human almost. It was something forged in places harsher than this training ground, something the rest of them couldn't begin to understand. And though they laughed, though they cursed her name, a seed had been planted in their minds. Maya Johnson was not weak. She was not ordinary. She was something else, something they couldn't define. And the longer she stayed silent, the more dangerous that something began to feel. The morning broke gray and damp, the kind of weather that sank into bones and made tempers short. The recruits filed into the training yard, dragging their bodies into line, mud clinging to their boots from the night's rain. Sergeant Walker stood near the fence, broad shoulders under a weathered jacket, eyes narrowed against the mist. He had seen more classes than he could count, watched countless hopefuls stumble, crack, and disappear before their first year was done. But this group had something different in it, something that set his instincts humming. It wasn't the loud ones, the braggarts who puffed up their chests and shouted the longest. It was the quiet woman who carried herself like silence was armor. Maya Johnson stood at attention near the end of the row, her face unreadable, hair damp from the drizzle, boots tied with perfect precision, despite the blood that still lingered beneath the cloth she'd wrapped around her foot. Walker's gaze kept drifting back to her. He dismissed her at first, the way most of the recruits had, another misfit dragged in by quotas or mistakes. But the rifle drill, the endurance run, the way she endured the jeers without flinching, there was something in her movements he recognized. He couldn't place it yet, but it made his chest tighten with a strange kind of memory. The drill for the day was close combat. The recruits were paired off, handed padded gloves, and sent into the ring under the instructor's watchful eyes. The yard filled with the sound of fists thudding against flesh, the grunts of bodies hitting the dirt, laughter when someone went down too easily. Maya waited her turn, silent as always, stretching her arms with slow precision. Madison smirked at her from across the circle, whispering loud enough for others to hear. "Can't wait to see Grandma knocked flat on her back." Laughter rippled, sharp and cruel, feeding off the tension. Walker's eyes narrowed. He saw the bruise on Maya's shoulder, the stiffness in her gait, but also the stillness that never left her. She was waiting, not for approval or attention, but for something else. He'd seen that stillness before, in men who had survived long enough to stop proving themselves. When the whistle blew and names were called, Maya was paired against a tall recruit with thick arms and more muscle than control. He charged at her with reckless energy, fists swinging wide. The crowd leaned in, eager for the spectacle. Maya sidestepped the first blow, her body moving with an economy that looked almost lazy. She didn't swing back. She didn't taunt. She let him exhaust himself, circling, weaving, slipping past each clumsy strike until his breathing turned ragged and his movements sloppy. Then, with a flick of her wrist, she caught his arm, shifted her weight, and sent him sprawling onto his back in the mud. It happened so fast the crowd went silent before bursting into shouts. Walker's breath caught in his chest. That wasn't academy training. That was something else, something old and deliberate. He folded his arms tighter, his eyes fixed on her as she helped her opponent to his feet without a word, then stepped back into line. As the drills continued, the recruits' laughter grew forced. Whispers replaced jeers, unease crawling in where arrogance had lived. They couldn't name it, but they felt it. Maya wasn't weak. She wasn't ordinary. And that truth unsettled them more than their jokes had satisfied. When the day finally ended and the yard cleared, Walker stayed behind, watching Maya as she gathered her gear. She moved with the same deliberate grace as always, tying off straps, checking buckles, no motion wasted. He approached slowly, boots heavy on the wet ground. She noticed him but didn't look up, as if she'd expected his presence all along. "You fight like you've done it before," he said, his voice low, more observation than accusation. Her hands paused for only a second before continuing. "Everyone here's done it before. That's why we're here." Walker studied her face, the calm mask that never cracked, the eyes that gave nothing away. Not like that. That wasn't training. That was instinct, muscle memory. He let the words hang, watching for any sign in her expression. Maya finally looked up, meeting his gaze with steady eyes. "Maybe I've had more practice falling than most." It wasn't an answer. Not really, but it was all she was going to give. Walker nodded slowly, though his chest tightened with a recognition he couldn't shake. He had seen this before, years ago, in places most of these recruits had never heard of, among men and women who carried marks on their skin that weren't meant for public eyes. As she walked away, he kept watching, the drizzle soaking into his collar. Something told him the laughter that had followed her since the day she arrived wouldn't last much longer. Something heavier was coming, and when it did, he'd be ready to bear witness. The training hall was packed tighter than usual. Recruits crammed shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with sweat and anticipation. The combat simulation was always the most popular drill, a chance to prove strength without the camouflage of excuses or group scores. The floor had been cleared, mats spread wide across the concrete, the ring marked by nothing more than the circle of bodies waiting to see who would fall. Everyone knew the matchups had been set with cruel irony. When the names were called, Maya Johnson was paired against Kyle. The laughter started immediately, the kind of laughter that crackled with expectation, like the audience at a play convinced they already knew the ending. Kyle rolled his shoulders and cracked his knuckles, grinning as he circled into the ring. "Finally," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "I get to shut Grandma down for good." His friends whooped, phones already up, recording, hungry for a clip they could replay until it turned into legend. Maya stepped into the ring without a word, her face calm, her posture almost casual, though the bruise on her shoulder from the rope course was still faintly visible. She looked like she was standing in line at a bus stop, not about to be thrown into a fight. The whistle blew and Kyle charged like a bull. He didn't test, didn't feint. He crashed into her with both hands, slamming her against the padded wall. The sound echoed across the room. The recruits erupted in laughter, clapping, shouting encouragement. Phones tilted higher, catching every angle. Kyle pressed his weight into her, grinning inches from her face. "You don't belong here, Johnson. Time to go home." He pulled her forward, then slammed her again for the crowd. The impact tore fabric. Her jacket gave way at the shoulder, ripping down her back in a jagged line. For the first time since she arrived at the academy, Maya looked exposed, her body pinned, her shirt torn. Madison shrieked with glee. "Look at her! She's got tattoos, too!" The laughter swelled, cruel and triumphant, feeding on the image of her finally humiliated. But then it happened. The torn fabric slipped further, and the mark beneath was revealed. Ink black as night sprawled across her shoulder blade. A hawk in full flight, wings stretched wide, talons gripping a laurel crown. The design was sharp, detailed, almost alive, the kind of work done not for beauty but for meaning. The laughter stumbled. Phones lowered slightly, confusion rippling through the crowd. They didn't recognize it, but Sergeant Walker did. His face drained of color, his jaw tightening as he took a step forward, eyes locked on the mark. Kyle froze too, though his grip stayed on her shirt. He stared at the tattoo, confusion clouding his arrogance. "What the hell is that supposed to be?" His voice cracked, just enough to betray the unease creeping in. The room fell quiet. The recruits shifted uncomfortably, whispering, their laughter dissolving into something more fragile. Walker's voice broke the silence, lower than it had been in years, a rasp filled with memory. "Where did you get that mark?" All eyes turned to him. The recruits glanced at one another, unsure why the old sergeant suddenly looked as if he were staring at a ghost. Maya's head lifted, her eyes steady, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the air. "I didn't ask for it. It was given to me." Kyle's grip loosened. For the first time since the whistle blew, he looked uncertain, his bravado shrinking. Madison swallowed hard, her phone slipping in her sweaty hand. Miguel, watching from the edge of the circle, felt his heart pounding. He didn't know what the hawk meant, but he could see what it did to Walker. Whatever it wasn't a decoration. It was a revelation. The silence deepened, heavy and electric, until it seemed the very walls leaned closer to listen. Walker stepped forward, his boots loud against the mat. He stared at the tattoo, then at Maya, then back at the tattoo again, his expression unreadable but trembling at the edges. For a long moment, no one spoke, no one breathed. Then he did something that made the recruit's blood run cold. He straightened to full attention, raised his hand, and saluted. Gasps rippled through the room. Phones wavered, hands shook. Nobody understood, but they all felt the ground shift beneath them. Kyle let go of Maya entirely, stumbling back a step, his face pale. The hawk ink on her back glistened under the harsh light, and the silence that followed was deeper than any laughter had ever been. Maya pulled the torn fabric across her shoulder, covering the mark without haste, her expression unchanged. But the damage or the revelation was done. The world inside that training hall would never look at her the same way again. The silence in the training hall held like a taut wire, every recruit caught in the strange gravity of what had just happened. Kyle's grin had vanished, his fists still raised but slack, his shoulders trembling with confusion. The ink on Maya's back was like a beacon none of them could look away from, the black hawk spreading its wings as if ready to lift off her skin. Madison lowered her phone, her hands shaking. No one had ever seen Sergeant Walker's face look the way it did now. Drawn, pale, his jaw locked like a man standing before a ghost. Walker took one more step forward. His boots thudded against the mat, his eyes fixed not on Maya's face but on the tattoo itself. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "Where did you get that?" The recruits leaned closer, as if the answer mattered to all of them. Maya didn't flinch, didn't blink. She stood straighter, her torn shirt hanging loose at her side, her voice quiet but clear. "It was given to me. I trained for it." Walker's breath caught. He looked like a man who wanted to argue, who wanted to dismiss her words as arrogance, but couldn't. He had seen that mark before, long ago, in a unit that had been whispered about and buried deep in classified files. The Hawk of Black Laurel, they had called it. A symbol carried only by operatives trained in silence and shadow, the ones who went where others could not, and none of them had ever survived long enough to pass it on. Until now. The recruits whispered, shifting uneasily. Kyle lowered his fists completely, his bravado crumbling. "That's just ink," he snapped, his voice desperate. "Anybody could get a tattoo." But even as he said it, his eyes betrayed him. He had seen the sergeant's reaction, seen the salute that broke every rule of rank and protocol. His voice cracked. "Right? It's just ink?" Walker turned his head slowly toward him, his gaze sharp as broken glass. "No one carries that mark unless they've earned it." The words struck harder than any blow. The recruits looked at Maya with new eyes, fear mixing with disbelief. Madison backed away, her phone slipping from her hands and clattering on the concrete. She muttered something under her breath, but no one cared. The story she thought she'd been filming had become something else entirely. Maya pulled the torn fabric across her shoulder again, but it was too late. The truth, or at least the piece of it she couldn't hide, was out. She looked at Walker, her expression calm. "You've seen it before." Walker nodded once, stiffly, like the motion itself cost him. "Years ago. Thought I'd never see it again." His voice softened, though his eyes never left her. "Who trained you?" For the first time, something flickered in Maya's expression. Not pride, not shame, but memory. A man who doesn't exist anymore. Miguel, standing just behind the line of recruits, felt his chest tighten. He remembered the way she tied her boots, the way she carried the sandbags, the way her shots hit center every time. None of it had been luck. None of it had been normal. He whispered to himself, barely audible, "I knew it." Kyle staggered forward, clinging to the scraps of his fading dominance. "I don't care what she's got inked on her back. You think that makes her special? Makes her better than us?" His words shook, his voice rising too high. "Prove it. Prove it in a real fight." The recruit shifted, eyes darting between him and Maya, uncertain. Some wanted to see it, some feared it, but none dared intervene. The air in the hall grew heavier, thick with the inevitability of what would come next. Walker's voice cut through the tension, hard as steel. "You don't want that, son." Kyle ignored him, fists raised again, his face red with humiliation. "I'm not scared of some mark. You want respect? You'll have to take it from me." Maya stood silent, her arms loose at her sides, her gaze steady on him. For the first time since she had arrived, her calm carried an edge sharp enough to slice through the air. She didn't raise her fists. She didn't take a stance. She simply stood there, watching him burn himself alive on his own pride. Walker's salute lowered, his hand dropping to his side as his face hardened. He knew what the others didn't, that Kyle was about to step into a storm he couldn't possibly weather. And as the recruits held their breath, the first cracks in their laughter widened into fear. Maya didn't move yet, but the fight had already shifted. The balance of power, the weight of silence, the truth of who she was, it was all in the room now, undeniable. And though Kyle couldn't see it, everyone else knew. This would not end the way he thought. The academy felt different in the days that followed, like the air itself had shifted. The recruits who used to laugh the loudest now lowered their voices when Maya walked past. Phones that once lit up to record her stumbles stayed tucked away. She was no longer their punchline, but she wasn't one of them either. She had become something apart, respected, feared, and avoided in equal measure. Kyle disappeared from the training yard for 2 full days, nursing his bruises and whatever pride he had left. When he returned, his swagger was gone. He kept his distance from Maya, muttering only to his closest friends, but even they looked unsettled when they laughed at his jokes. The shadow of what had happened in the hall hung over him like a storm cloud, and the recruits who had once orbited his confidence now drifted away. Madison fared worse. Word had spread about the video she had tried to film during the fight, how she had fumbled it when the tattoo was revealed, and how she'd backed away like a frightened child while the sergeant saluted Maya. It made her look cowardly, small. The same people who once laughed at her barbs now whispered about her behind her back. She kept her chin high, but her eyes darted more than before, searching for allies that weren't there. The command staff didn't stay silent either. Meetings were held behind closed doors, and though the recruits weren't privy to them, rumors leaked out quickly. The old sergeant had been called in, asked hard questions about what he had seen, about why he had saluted a recruit in open defiance of protocol. The story spread like wildfire. Walker had confirmed it. The mark was real. And anyone with sense knew that meant Maya Johnson was not simply a trainee. It wasn't long before changes followed. At the next morning assembly, Captain Reeves announced new assignments. His voice carried across the yard, sharp and final. Effective immediately, Johnson will serve as a training assistant. She will run drills. You will treat her instructions as you would mine. The words rippled through the formation like a stone dropped in water. Eyes snapped toward Maya, some with disbelief, others with outright resentment. Kyle muttered under his breath. She didn't earn that, but no one backed him. The silence that greeted his complaint was louder than agreement could have been. Maya didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply nodded once, acknowledging the order, and stepped forward when called. That day she ran the recruits through weapons disassembly drills, her hands moving with the same efficient precision they had all witnessed before. Some tried to drag their feet to show their disdain, but her patience was unshakable. She walked the line, correcting their grip, adjusting their timing, her voice calm and firm. When she demonstrated, it was faster, cleaner, and more exact than any of them could match. Even the most stubborn fell into line. Miguel felt something close to pride swell in his chest as he watched. He remembered the way she had been treated when she first arrived, the spilled food, the muttered slurs, the laughter that followed her everywhere. Now those same people avoided her eyes, tripping over themselves to obey her commands. He caught her glance once, just for a second, and though her expression didn't change, he thought he saw a flicker of acknowledgement, as if she knew he had seen her truth before the rest. But respect wasn't universal. In the dorms, tension simmered. Some recruits muttered that it wasn't fair, that she had been handed authority she hadn't earned through the same grind they had. Madison, bitter and cornered, stoked those fires. You think this is about her skills? No, it's favoritism. They're protecting her because of whatever that mark means. Her words found ears, and though no one repeated them too loudly, the resentment grew in shadows. The instructors, however, made it clear they were watching. Mistakes that had once been overlooked were punished harshly now. Kyle was reassigned to latrine duty for mouthing off. Madison lost weekend leave for ignoring instructions. The message was clear. The time for childish games was over, and Maya's quiet authority was no longer a joke. In one of the final drills of the week, Maya led a team exercise in the field. They were tasked with securing a mock perimeter, moving in coordination under pressure. She gave clear signals, sharp and confident, honed by something deeper than academy training. Most of the recruits followed, but Madison deliberately ignored her cue, charging ahead and triggering a trap set by the instructors. The blaring alarm ended the drill instantly. The captain stormed in, furious, demanding answers. Maya spoke calmly, her voice steady. I signaled her to wait. She ignored it. Madison tried to protest, her words slick with practiced innocence, but the overhead drone footage told the truth. It showed her turning her head away from Maya's signals, her defiance undeniable. The captain's punishment was swift and public. Madison's squad lost 50 points, and she was ordered to scrub floors for a week. The yard fell silent. The laughter that had once greeted Maya's every stumble was gone, replaced by a heavy awareness that the ground beneath them had shifted for good. Even the instructors treated her differently now, no longer dismissing her as supply crew or dead weight. They paused to ask her opinion during briefings, listened when she spoke, weighed her words carefully. It wasn't just respect anymore, it was recognition. That night, Miguel found her alone, sitting outside under the dim glow of the floodlights, cleaning her weapon. He hesitated, then sat beside her. For a long while neither spoke, the silence between them steady, almost comfortable. Finally he said, They're starting to see it, what I saw before, that you more. Maya looked at him, her expression as calm as ever, but her voice carried a trace of something softer. It doesn't matter what they see, it matters what they do with it. Miguel nodded slowly. He didn't press her further, but as he sat there, listening to the sound of cloth sliding against metal, he knew the academy had changed forever. Maya Johnson wasn't the outcast anymore. She wasn't their target. She was their measure. And whether they liked it or not, the rest of them would be judged against her from now on. The campus had settled into a brittle quiet after weeks of upheaval. Recruits went about their routines, running drills, eating in the mess, sleeping in the dorms, but the atmosphere was no longer the same. They moved with a wary awareness, as though the ground they stood on had shifted in ways they couldn't quite name. Maya Johnson's presence had become part of that shift. No one laughed when she walked by anymore. No one dared spill food on her or shove her off balance. Even those who still resented her authority swallowed their words when she entered a room. She had gone from the target of mockery to the axis around which the academy turned. One night, long after lights out, Maya sat alone on her bunk with the room washed in silence. Most of the recruits were asleep, their breathing slow, dreams carrying them to places beyond these cinder block walls. She stared at the old photograph she kept hidden, the creases worn deep now from her fingers. The blurred face of the man beside her was as haunting as ever, his shadow reaching across years and miles. She pressed the picture against her chest and closed her eyes, listening to the hum of the pipes and the distant wind rattling against the window frames. The stillness was broken by the shrill buzz of a phone. Not the cheap, government-issued devices the recruits were allowed, but a secure line hidden deep in her pack. She pulled it out, the weight of it cold and familiar. For a long moment she stared at the glowing number on the screen, an unlisted code she hadn't seen in years. She answered with a steady voice, "Johnson." A pause, then a clipped voice on the other end. Code Phoenix, 48 hours. Her hand tightened around the phone. The words were simple, but the weight of them was crushing. Phoenix. She thought it had been buried for good. She had trained herself to believe those ghosts were gone, that the chapter had closed when she walked away into obscurity. She forced her voice even. I thought Phoenix was terminated. So did we, the caller said. But it's not. We'll brief you at the usual place. You know what's at stake. The line went dead. Maya sat motionless, the phone pressed against her thigh. She looked up and found Miguel standing at the door, his face half lit by the hallway glow. He hadn't meant to overhear, but his expression told her he had heard enough to know this wasn't an ordinary call. You're leaving, he said quietly. She slipped the phone back into her pack, zipping it closed with deliberate calm. This was never forever, she answered. Miguel stepped closer, his voice low, almost pleading. They'll never understand what you've done here, how much you've changed this place. Maya gave the smallest of nods. They don't have to. They just have to carry the lesson. The next morning, she reported to the yard as usual. Drills were run, orders were given, and she performed her role without falter. But those closest to her sensed a change, a tightening in her movements, a sharper edge in her gaze. Even Sergeant Walker, who had come to regard her with a mixture of respect and something bordering on awe, seemed to recognize the shift. He caught her eye once and gave a single, knowing nod. By evening, her pack was ready, stashed beneath her bunk. No one noticed when she slipped out, except for Miguel. He followed her to the edge of the lot, where the cracked pavement met the long stretch of road disappearing into the dusk. She paused there, her back to him, the hawk tattoo hidden beneath her jacket, but burning in memory for all who had seen it. Miguel's voice trembled. Will you ever come back? She turned just enough to meet his eyes, her expression calm, unreadable as always, yet softened by the weight of unspoken truths. That's not how this works. She adjusted her strap, walked to the waiting car, and disappeared into the growing dark. The hum of the engine faded, leaving Miguel alone in the quiet. He stood for a long time, staring at the road until it became only shadow. Then he turned back toward the barracks, carrying with him the knowledge that he had witnessed something the others might never fully grasp. Inside the academy, recruits whispered about her for weeks. Stories spread, details warped, but the image remained. The woman who had come in looking like nothing, who had borne their ridicule in silence, who had bled and endured, and who had left carrying a secret larger than any of them could imagine. Some spoke of her as a caution, others as a legend, but all of them remembered the moment the laughter had stopped. Years later, the story still lived in the walls. New recruits were told about the fight, about the salute, about the hawk tattoo. They were warned not to underestimate anyone who stood beside them in uniform, no matter how ordinary they looked. The lesson had become part of the academy's fabric. As for Maya Johnson, her name faded from rosters and reports, tucked into classified files no one at the academy would ever see. But somewhere, out in the world where shadows moved and ghosts of the past refused to die, she was called back into the storm. And though the recruits she left behind would never know the details, they would always remember the silence she carried, the kind that spoke louder than all their laughter combined.